In the small town of Millsboro, Kentucky, in June 2018, the life of Sheriff Leroy Thompson flowed with a steady, predictable rhythm. Each morning, he woke up in the two-story house he shared with his wife on the outskirts of town, a modest but well-kept home with white siding and a wraparound porch. The scent of frying bacon and brewing coffee greeted him as he descended the stairs, a ritual that had defined his days for years. Camilla, his wife of 22 years, was already in the kitchen, her hands moving with practiced ease as she prepared breakfast. Scrambled eggs flecked with bits of crisp bacon and a mug of coffee so strong it could wake a man from a coma. Leroy, a sturdy 48-year-old with a broad chest and a calm demeanor, was the pride of Millsboro, a town of just over 5,000 souls nestled among rolling hills and patches of dense forest. As sheriff, he had earned a reputation for fairness and firmness, keeping the peace in a place where trouble rarely stirred beyond the occasional bar scuffle or petty theft. Camilla, a woman of 45 with a warm smile and a knack for nurturing, filled her days tending to their home and leading the local gardening club. Under her care, their yard had transformed into a vibrant oasis, bursting with roses, hydrangeas, and neatly trimmed hedges that drew admiring glances from neighbors. She wore a floral apron over her house dress that morning, her hair pulled back in a loose bun, and though she moved with her usual grace, Leroy noticed a faint heaviness in her steps. Dark circles shadowed her eyes and her hands lingered a moment too long on the countertop, as if steadying herself. When he asked if she was feeling all right, she brushed it off with a quick wave, blaming a restless night, and he accepted her explanation without pressing further. Trust had always been the bedrock of their marriage, a union that seemed to embody the quiet stability Millsboro prized. No loud arguments, no whispered scandals, just the steady hum of a shared life built on routines like their evening tea on the porch, where they watched the sun dip below the tree line. Leroy left the house that morning in his pressed khaki uniform, the star-shaped badge glinting on his chest as he climbed into his patrol truck. The drive into town took him past familiar sights: the red brick post office, the diner with its flickering neon sign, and the old oak tree that marked the center of Main Street. At the sheriff's station, a squat building with peeling paint and a flagpole out front, his day unfolded as it always did. He reviewed the overnight logs, noting a complaint about teenagers racing dirt bikes near the creek, then met with his deputies to assign patrol routes. A stack of paperwork awaited him: requisitions for new radios and plans for the upcoming Millsboro Summer Festival, an event that drew folks from neighboring counties with its pie contests and live music. Leroy worked through it all methodically, his pen scratching across forms, his mind occasionally drifting to Camilla's tired face, but never lingering long enough to spark real concern. The sun was high by the time he stepped outside to stretch his legs, the air thick with the scent of cut grass and gasoline from a nearby lawnmower. He exchanged nods with passers-by, old Mr. Grayson hobbling to the hardware store, Mrs. Tillman carrying a basket of laundry, each greeting a reminder of the tight-knit community he'd sworn to protect. Back at the station, he grabbed a sandwich from the vending machine and ate at his desk, the hum of a box fan cutting through the stillness. The afternoon passed with a call about a missing cat, which turned up napping in a shed, and a brief meeting with the mayor to finalize festival security. By 5 o'clock, Leroy locked up and headed home, the truck's tires crunching over gravel as he pulled into the driveway. Camilla had set up dinner in the backyard that evening, a simple spread of grilled chicken, cornbread, and a pitcher of sweet tea laid out on a checkered tablecloth. The garden buzzed with the soft drone of bees, and fireflies began to flicker as dusk settled in. She wore a light cotton dress now, her apron discarded, and though she smiled as she served him a plate, Leroy couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Her laughter at his story about the cat rescue sounded a little forced, and her gaze drifted to the horizon more than once, as if lost in thought. He watched her across the table, the woman who'd stood by him through his early days as a deputy, through the lean years when they scraped by on his salary, through the quiet nights when they'd sit together planning a future that never quite included the children they'd once hoped for. As he sipped his tea, the ice clinking against the glass, a faint unease tugged at him, a whisper of doubt he couldn't name. But the day had been long, and the warmth of the meal dulled his senses, so he pushed the feeling aside, chalking it up to fatigue. The stars emerged overhead, and they lingered outside until the air grew cool, then retreated indoors, the screen door creaking shut behind them, sealing another day in their seemingly perfect world. The days following that quiet evening in the backyard brought subtle shifts that gnawed at Leroy's sense of normalcy, changes he couldn't dismiss no matter how hard he tried. Camilla's absences from home grew more frequent, her departures marked by vague excuses that drifted through the air like smoke. She'd mention a lunch with friends from the gardening club or a quick trip to the nursery for mulch and seedlings. But when she returned, often well after the sun had dipped below the horizon, her hands were empty. No bags of soil, no pots of flowers, just the faint scent of perfume clinging to her clothes. Her eyes, once so steady when they met his, now darted away, fixed on some distant point, as if she were piecing together a puzzle he couldn't see. The phone, a sleek black device that used to sit unattended on the kitchen table next to the sugar bowl, had become an extension of her, a constant companion she tucked into her pocket or clutched in her hand. Leroy noticed how she'd snatch it up the moment he stepped into a room, her fingers curling around it protectively, the screen angled away from his view. One humid night, the kind where the air hung heavy and the crickets sang relentlessly outside, Leroy stirred from sleep, his body slick with sweat beneath the cotton sheets. The clock on the nightstand glowed 2:14 a.m., its red digits casting a faint light across the room. The bed beside him was empty, the pillow still bearing the indent of Camilla's head. He lay still for a moment, listening, until the soft creak of floorboards drew his attention downstairs. Slipping out of bed, he padded barefoot to the landing, peering over the railing into the dimness of the living room below. There she stood, silhouetted against the window, the curtains parted just enough to let moonlight spill across the hardwood. Her voice was a hushed murmur, too low to catch the words, but the urgency in her tone prickled the hairs on the back of his neck. She paced a slow circle, one hand pressing the phone to her ear, the other tugging at the hem of her nightgown. When she finally hung up, she lingered by the glass, staring out into the dark yard, her shoulders slumped as if carrying a weight she couldn't shed. By the time Leroy crept back to bed, his heart thudded unevenly, though he couldn't pinpoint why. Morning came with the usual clatter of pans in the kitchen, and Camilla greeted him with a plate of biscuits and gravy, her smile bright but brittle. When he asked who she'd been talking to so late, she waved a hand dismissively, claiming it was her sister in Louisville catching up after months apart. Leroy nodded, swallowing the lie along with his coffee, though he knew full well her sister had packed up and moved to Tennessee 2 years prior, a fact Camilla herself had lamented over Christmas dinner. The contradiction lodged in his mind like a splinter, sharp and persistent, but he didn't press her. Years as a sheriff had honed his instincts, taught him to spot the flicker of deceit in a suspect's eyes, yet he recoiled from turning that lens on his wife. To suspect her felt like a betrayal of the life they'd built, a violation of the trust that had carried them through 22 years of marriage. At the station, the rhythm of work offered a temporary reprieve. A shopkeeper reported a missing crate of soda from the back of his store, likely swiped by kids cutting through the alley, and a farmer called about a neighbor's dog harassing his chickens. Leroy dispatched deputies to handle both, then settled at his desk to review the week's incident reports, the ceiling fan whirring overhead. The tasks were mundane, the kind that kept Millsboro humming along without fanfare, but his focus wavered. A dull ache had settled into his bones, a weariness that tugged at his limbs and clouded his thoughts. He rubbed his temples, chalking it up to the late nights and the creeping march of middle age, though he couldn't recall feeling this drain before. He pushed through the day, his boots scuffing the linoleum as he moved between his office and the break room, where the coffee pot sat perpetually half full. That evening, as he sat on the porch nursing a glass of water, Camilla emerged from the house with a small duffel bag slung over her shoulder. She announced she was driving to Louisville to visit an old friend, a woman named Marla she hadn't seen in years. The suddenness of it caught Leroy off guard. Camilla rarely left town without planning ahead, her days usually tethered to the garden and the house. But her tone left little room for questions. She promised to be back the next afternoon, scribbling a note on the pad by the fridge before kissing his cheek and heading to her sedan. The engine sputtered to life, and he watched the taillights fade down the gravel road, a plume of dust rising in their wake. Alone in the house, he wandered from room to room, the silence pressing against him. He picked up the note she'd left. "Back tomorrow, don't worry, love you," and traced the loops of her handwriting with his thumb. The words felt hollow, a thin shield against the unease coiling in his gut. He sank into the armchair by the fireplace, staring at the cold hearth, and wondered why her trips, once rare and purposeful, had become a pattern he couldn't quite grasp. The crickets chirped on outside, and the night stretched long and restless before him. Camilla returned from Louisville the next afternoon, her sedan rolling into the driveway, just as the sun began its slow descent behind the hills. She stepped out of the car, her duffel bag slung over one shoulder, and Leroy watched from the porch as she moved toward the house. Her face was drawn, the lines around her mouth deeper than he remembered, and her steps lacked the usual spring that had once carried her through the garden. She brushed past him with a faint smile, muttering something about the heat wearing her out, and disappeared inside to unpack. Leroy followed her into the kitchen, his concern sharpening into something more insistent. Her skin had a sallow tint, and the shadows under her eyes had darkened, pooling like ink against her cheekbones. He suggested she see a doctor, his voice steady but firm, pointing out how she'd been off for weeks. She shook her head, insisting it was just a cold, picked up from the damp Louisville air, and turned away to fill a glass with water from the sink. Her refusal landed like a stone in his chest, heavy and unyielding, but he let it drop, unwilling to push her into a corner. His own body, meanwhile, had begun to betray him in ways he couldn't ignore. The weakness that had crept into his limbs grew more pronounced, a dull ache that settled into his joints and refused to lift. Headaches came on without warning, sharp pulses behind his eyes that blurred the edges of his vision, and at night he woke drenched in sweat, the sheets clinging to his skin despite the cool breeze drifting through the open window. He chalked it up to stress at first, the late hours at the station, the weight of keeping Millsboro safe. But the symptoms lingered, gnawing at his resolve. At the sheriff's office, his deputy Dwayne noticed the change. The younger man, lean and sharp-eyed, caught Leroy leaning heavily on his desk one morning, his breath shallow as he sorted through patrol schedules. Dwayne suggested a checkup, his tone casual but laced with worry, and Leroy nodded, the idea taking root. He called Dr. Harper's office that afternoon, booking an appointment with the town's only physician, a wiry man with graying hair and a no-nonsense manner who'd patched up half of Millsboro at one time or another. The visit came 2 days later, a Thursday morning, when the sky hung low with gray clouds threatening rain. Dr. Harper's clinic sat on the edge of town, a single-story building with faded shingles and a gravel lot out front. Leroy sat on the exam table, the paper crinkling beneath him as the doctor pressed a stethoscope to his chest and shone a light into his eyes. The questions came next. How long had he felt this way? Any fever? Any unusual symptoms? And Leroy answered as best he could, his voice steady despite the tremor in his hands. Dr. Harper frowned, scribbling notes on a clipboard, then ordered a full panel of blood tests, sending Leroy to the lab down the hall with a slip of paper. The needle pricked his arm, and he watched the vial fill with dark red, a vague unease settling over him as he drove back to the station afterward, the windshield wipers swiping at a light drizzle. The results arrived 3 days later, on a Sunday when the town was quiet, most folks at church or nursing hangovers from Saturday night. Dr. Harper called Leroy personally, asking him to come in right away, and the urgency in the man's voice tightened Leroy's gut. He arrived at the clinic just after noon, the waiting room empty save for a stack of outdated magazines on a side table. Dr. Harper ushered him into the office, closing the door with a soft click, and sat behind his desk, a manila folder open before him. The diagnosis hit Leroy like a freight train. HIV, the letters stark and impossible as they hung in the air. Dr. Harper explained that the infection appeared recent, likely contracted within the past year, and asked about potential exposure, partners, needles, anything that might explain it. Leroy sat frozen, his mind blank, unable to form a response. He'd been faithful to Camilla since the day they met, their intimacy a constant through every season of their marriage. The doctor's words faded into a dull hum as Leroy stared at the wall, a framed diploma blurring in his vision, until he managed a numb thank you and stumbled back to his truck. He drove home in a daze, the road unfurling before him like a ribbon he couldn't quite grasp. The house was silent when he stepped inside, Camilla upstairs napping after lunch, her soft snores drifting down the hall. His legs carried him to the living room, where he sank into the armchair, the weight of the truth pressing him into the cushions. He needed to know if she carried the same burden, if she'd hidden this from him. That evening, after she'd gone to bed early claiming fatigue, Leroy crept to her side of the bedroom. Her purse sat on the dresser, a leather satchel she'd carried for years, and he hesitated only a moment before unzipping it. His fingers brushed past a wallet and a tube of lipstick until they closed around a small orange bottle tucked into a side pocket. He pulled it out, the label stark under the lamplight. Anti-retroviral medication, prescribed 3 months ago by a clinic in Louisville. The name was hers, unmistakable, and the date stared back at him like an accusation. She'd known, had been treating it in secret, and in that silence, she'd passed it to him. He stood there, the bottle trembling in his hand, as the room spun around him. Anger surged, hot and jagged, warring with a grief so deep it threatened to swallow him whole. He sank to the floor beside the bed, the prescription crumpled in his fist, and sat in the dark, the sound of her breathing a cruel echo in the stillness. Sleep eluded Leroy that night, his mind a churning sea of questions that refused to settle. He remained on the floor beside the bed until the first gray light of dawn seeped through the curtains, the prescription bottle still clutched in his hand, its edges digging into his palm. How had Camilla contracted this? When had it happened? And why had she kept it buried, letting it seep into their lives like poison? As the house stirred awake, he slipped the bottle back into her purse, his movements mechanical, and rose to his feet, resolve hardening within him. He wouldn't confront her yet, not until he could watch her, study her, piece together the truth she'd hidden. When she emerged from the bedroom, her hair tied back and a robe cinched around her waist, she moved to the kitchen with a purpose that belied the tremor in her hands. She cracked eggs into a skillet, the sizzle filling the air, and set a pot of coffee brewing, her routine unchanged on the surface. But Leroy saw the cracks. Her fingers fumbled with the spatula, and the smile she flashed him as he sat at the table was tight. A thin veneer stretched over something unspoken. He ate in silence, the eggs tasteless on his tongue, his eyes tracing her every motion. She watered the potted geraniums on the windowsill after breakfast, the watering can shaking slightly as she tilted it, droplets spilling onto the counter. Her composure held, but it was fragile, a threadbare curtain hiding a storm. Leroy's thoughts drifted back through the years, unbidden memories rising like ghosts. He saw her as she'd been when they met in Louisville, a bright-eyed woman working at a bakery, her laugh warm as she handed him a free biscuit on his beat. He'd been a rookie cop then, all bravado and ambition, and her kindness had softened him, drawn him in. She'd stood by him when he earned his sheriff's badge, her hands steady on his shoulders as he swore his oath, and they'd sat together on countless nights, dreaming of a family that never came. Her miscarriages a quiet sorrow they'd buried together. Those moments had felt real, solid, but now they crumbled in his mind, tainted by the secret she'd carried. Suspicion took root, a dark weed twisting through his thoughts. The virus hadn't come from him. He'd never strayed, never given her reason to doubt his fidelity. That left only one possibility. She'd been with someone else. The idea clawed at him, raw and relentless, a betrayal that turned his stomach. He watched her wipe down the counter, her movements jerky, and wondered who it could have been when it had happened, how long she'd lived this double life. At the station that morning, he carried the weight of it with him, his boots dragging across the gravel lot as he entered the low brick building. The day's work loomed, reports to file, a meeting with the festival committee, but his mind was elsewhere. He called Dwayne into his office, the deputy's lanky frame filling the doorway, and asked him to pull Camilla's phone records. It was a favor, off the books, and he kept his voice low, citing a vague need to check something personal. Dwayne nodded, his brow furrowing slightly, but he didn't question it, slipping out to make the calls through a contact at the phone company. Leroy spent the day in a haze, his body protesting with every step. The weakness had deepened, a leaden pull in his muscles, and his head throbbed with a dull, persistent ache. He sat at his desk, staring at the grain of the wood, the paperwork untouched as his thoughts spiraled. The station buzzed around him, deputies answering calls, the radio crackling with static. But he felt detached, a man adrift in a life that no longer made sense. Dwayne returned the next afternoon, a manila envelope in hand, and slid it across the desk. Leroy opened it, his pulse quickening as he scanned the list of numbers. One stood out, repeated dozens of times over the past 3 months. A Louisville area code, calls lasting minutes, sometimes hours, often late at night. Dwayne had scribbled a name beside it, Terrence Wilkes. The name hit Leroy like a punch, a faint memory surfacing. Camilla mentioning a Terrence years ago, an old friend from her bakery days, someone she'd laughed about over dinner once. Back then, it had meant nothing, a passing anecdote, but now it burned in his chest, a spark igniting a fire of rage. He folded the paper and tucked it into his pocket, his jaw tight as he thanked Dwayne and sent him back to patrol. The name echoed in his mind, a drumbeat of suspicion that drowned out the station's hum. He pictured her with this man, imagined stolen moments in Louisville, her trips suddenly cast in a new, sinister light. The anger grew, a living thing coiling around his heart, but he held it in check, determined to wait. He needed more. Proof, a confession, something to anchor the storm inside him. His body faltered as he drove home that evening, the truck's wheels slick under his sweating palms, his vision swimming briefly at a stop sign. He pulled into the driveway, the house glowing softly in the dusk, and saw Camilla through the window, pruning roses in the garden. She looked up as he approached, her smile faltering for a fraction of a second, and he nodded back, his face a mask. The moment wasn't right, not yet, but the fury simmered, fed by every glance she avoided, every nervous twitch of her hands, and he knew it wouldn't stay contained forever. Friday evening arrived with a stillness that hung over Millsboro, the sky streaked with orange as the sun sank low. Leroy pulled into the driveway earlier than usual, his truck's engine cutting off with a soft sputter, the weight of the day clinging to him like damp cloth. He stepped out, his boots crunching on the gravel, and paused for a moment, staring at the house bathed in the fading light. The roses Camilla had pruned earlier nodded in the breeze, their petals vivid against the dusk, and through the living room window, he saw her silhouette on the couch. He entered without a sound, the screen door easing shut behind him, and found her there, a magazine open on her lap, her fingers trembling as they turned a page. She didn't look up immediately, her posture stiff, as if she sensed the storm brewing in his silence. Leroy moved past her, his steps deliberate, and entered the kitchen, the linoleum cool beneath his feet. He opened the drawer beside the sink, the one where he kept his service pistol when off duty, a sleek black Glock he'd carried for years, and lifted it out, the metal cold and heavy in his hand. He set it on the table with a soft thud, positioning it between them, and turned his gaze on her, unblinking. Camilla's eyes flicked up at the sound, meeting his, and a flicker of fear darted across her face, quick as a shadow. She set the magazine aside, her hands folding into her lap, but she didn't move from the couch. Leroy reached into his pocket, his fingers brushing the crumpled prescription he'd carried since that night, and pulled it free. He tossed it onto the table beside the gun, the orange bottle's label stark against the wood, and watched her reaction unfold. Her breath caught, a sharp intake that broke the quiet, and her face drained of color, leaving her skin ashen under the lamplight. She stared at the bottle, then at him, her lips parting slightly, but no denial came. Instead, she leaned forward, her hands gripping the edge of the couch, and began to explain. Her voice was low, unsteady, as she admitted she'd learned of her HIV 6 months ago, a diagnosis delivered after a night in Louisville, a party, a fleeting encounter with Terrence, a mistake she couldn't undo. She'd kept it secret, terrified of losing him, and pleaded for forgiveness, her eyes glistening with tears as she reached out a hand he didn't take. Leroy stood rooted, her words crashing over him like waves against a crumbling shore. Each syllable carved deeper into the wound, her betrayal, the virus now coursing through his own blood, the months of lies stacked between them like bricks. His chest tightened, a vice of rage and grief squeezing the air from his lungs, and his vision narrowed until all he saw was her, the woman he'd loved, now a stranger unraveling his world. His hand moved to the pistol, fingers closing around the grip, and he lifted it, the barrel tilting toward her almost of its own accord. He didn't think, didn't plan. His mind was a roar of static, drowning out reason. Camilla froze, her outstretched hand dropping, her body tensing as the gun trained on her chest. The room held its breath, the ticking of the wall clock the only sound, until a sudden sharp crack split the silence. A backfire from an old pickup rumbling past on the road outside, its exhaust popping like a gunshot in the still air. Leroy's nerves, frayed to breaking, reacted before his mind could catch up. His finger, already resting on the trigger, twitched reflexively, and the pistol discharged with a deafening bang. The bullet tore through the space between them, striking Camilla square in the chest, a red bloom erupting against her pale blouse. She staggered, a gasp escaping her lips, and collapsed backward onto the couch before sliding to the floor, her body crumpling like a marionette with cut strings. Blood spread across the carpet, a dark stain seeping into the fibers, and Leroy dropped the gun, the clatter of metal on wood jolting him from his stupor. He lunged forward, falling to his knees beside her, his hands pressing against the wound, warm and slick beneath his palms. Her chest heaved once, twice, then faltered, her pulse fluttering weakly under his fingers as he tried to staunch the flow, crimson coating his skin. Panic seized him, a wild clawing thing, and he scrambled to his feet, snatching his phone from his pocket. His hands shook as he dialed 911, the numbers blurring through tears he didn't realize he'd shed, and he barked their address into the receiver, his voice cracking as he begged for help. He dropped back to her side, cradling her head, her hair soft against his calloused fingers, and whispered her name, over and over, as if it could tether her to life. Her eyes, wide and glassy, stared past him, her breath shallow and ragged, then stilled altogether. The phone slipped from his grasp, landing in the pooling blood, and he pulled her closer, rocking slightly, his mind reeling with the reality of what he'd done. Outside, the distant wail of sirens grew louder, cutting through the night, but they came too late. Camilla lay limp in his arms, her warmth fading, and Leroy sat there, surrounded by the wreckage of their life, the echo of the shot ringing in his ears as the world closed in. The flashing lights of patrol cars bathed the house in red and blue as deputies stormed through the front door, their boots thudding against the hardwood. Leroy didn't resist when they pulled him away from Camilla's body, his hands slick with her blood, the cuffs clicking tight around his wrists. They guided him outside, past the roses now shrouded in darkness, and into the back of a cruiser, its interior smelling faintly of stale coffee and leather. He sat numbly, staring through the window as the familiar shape of his home receded, the night swallowing it whole. At the station, the fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting harsh shadows across the interrogation room where they left him, still in his blood-stained shirt, the metallic tang clinging to his skin. Dwayne arrived soon after, his face pale and drawn, disbelief etched into every line as he sat across the table. Leroy recounted the night in a monotone, his voice hollow, the diagnosis that had shattered him, Camilla's confession of infidelity and illness, the gunshot triggered by the truck's backfire. Each word fell flat, stripped of emotion, because he knew no explanation could undo the act. No plea could bring her back. News of the tragedy spread through Millsboro like wildfire, igniting whispers in the diner, the grocery store, the pews of the Baptist church. By morning, the town was abuzz with fragmented stories. Some painted Leroy as a man broken by betrayal, deserving of pity. Others condemned him as a monster who'd let rage erase decades of duty. The festival planning halted, the streets quieted, and neighbors avoided the house on the outskirts, its windows dark and curtains drawn. Leroy's trial came swiftly, a somber affair in the county courthouse 30 miles away, where a judge in a black robe listened to the evidence. The prosecutor detailed the shooting, The defense argued the unintentional nature of the act, citing Leroy's clean record and the shock of the moment. The jury deliberated for 2 days, returning with a verdict of manslaughter, a concession to the circumstances, but a heavy one nonetheless. The sentence landed like a hammer, 15 years in the state penitentiary, a stretch that would see him past 60 before he breathed free air again. He nodded at the gavel's crack, his face impassive, and let the bailiffs lead him away. The prison sat an hour's drive from Millsboro, a sprawling complex of gray concrete surrounded by razor wire and rolling fields. Leroy's cell was a narrow box, 8 feet by 10, with a bunk, a steel toilet, and a sliver of a window that offered a view of the sky sliced by bars. They allowed him one personal item, and he chose a photograph from their first vacation together, a faded print of him and Camilla standing by the Cumberland River, her arm looped through his, both of them grinning against a backdrop of rippling water and green hills. He taped it to the wall above his bunk, its edges curling with time, and spent hours staring at it, tracing the lines of her face with his eyes. The days blurred into a monotony of routine. Meals of lukewarm oatmeal and tough meat, exercise in a fenced yard under a guard's watchful gaze, nights broken by the snores and murmurs of other inmates. His hands, once steady with a badge and gun, now rested idle, the calluses softening as he grappled with the void left behind. He replayed the night endlessly in his mind, each detail a shard of glass, her trembling voice, the pistol's weight, the deafening pop that had stolen her from him. The anger that had consumed him had burned out, leaving only ash and a hollow ache. He understood now that it had destroyed them both, her life snuffed out on the carpet, his consigned to these walls. Word trickled in through a guard that Terrence Wilkes had vanished from Louisville shortly after the news broke. His apartment emptied overnight. No forwarding address left behind. Leroy felt no satisfaction in that, only a faint ripple of bitterness for the man who'd set this chain in motion and slipped away unscathed. In Millsboro, the garden Camilla had tended with such care began to wither, the roses choked by weeds, the hedges sprawling wild as neighbors passed by without stopping. The house stood empty, its paint peeling under the Kentucky sun, a silent monument to what had been. Leroy sat alone in his cell most days, the photograph his only companion, its image a lifeline to a past he couldn't reclaim. He traced their laughter in his memory, the warmth of her hand in his, the plans they'd woven together, and wondered where it had all unraveled. The question haunted him. Could he have stopped, listened, let her words bridge the gap before his finger found the trigger? He saw her eyes in those final moments, wide with shock and something softer, maybe regret, and wished he'd given her the chance to finish what she'd started to say. The prison walls pressed close, but the real confinement was within, a cage of guilt and loss he'd built himself. Outside, life in Millsboro rolled on, the seasons turning, the town healing its wounds, while Leroy remained, a shadow of the sheriff he'd been, tethered to a photograph and the echoes of a love he'd lost to his own hand,